Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Grace Laubacher, and I am one of the scenic designers of Oklahoma that just opened in the West End. And I have this lovely team assembled with me who are all going to introduce themselves now.
Hello, everybody. My name is Fridthjofur Thorsteinsson, which is a very difficult Icelandic name. I'm the associate lighting designer on Oklahoma, but everybody calls me Fifi.
I'm Drew Levy. I'm the sound designer for Oklahoma.
And I'm Josh Thorson, the video projections designer.
The subject of this webinar is 3D modeling and 3D design in Vectorworks, and also project sharing as a collaborative tool in theater design. And the four of us were members of the design team, as I mentioned, of Oklahoma, which is you can see on the screen right now is a production that has had many iterations, both in New York and in London. And it is a very sort of simple design in many ways, but also requires a lot of precision, and all the elements have to correspond and integrate really seamlessly in order for the show to work. So having done the show a number of times together, we've been refining and developing that process of collaborating over several years now. And this latest production was at the Wyndham Theatre in London. And as you can see, the design is somewhat immersive in the space. So we have a sort of traditional proscenium arch here with a set, on the stage house proper. And then we also have a lot of scenic design and other design elements that extend out into the theater house. So we have plywood cladding over some of the theater boxes. We have overhead scenic and lighting elements, all of which have to be integrated with speakers and video projectors, and everything needs to sort of live in the same world visually. And so that is the challenge always with the show. And so I'm just going to start. Just give me a second. I will share the Vectorworks. So over the last couple of productions, we've been both in London. So we had the Young Vic production, which opened last year in 2022, was in a much smaller theater with a sort of surround environment. And we, it was a quicker process. So there was some 3D that I did, and I think all of us did separately as part of our processes, but we didn't really have the time or the bandwidth to sort of fully integrate the process. So going into this Wyndham production, we sort of understood certain things that we could improve, and we decided to try and integrate our 3D processes. So I drew the set, and I think one of the advantages of working in this 3D format is that it's much easier to share with the wider group. So, for example, the director, Daniel Fish, was working in Europe for a lot of the design process. So although we had a physical model that we were working with when we could, this also was a way for me to hop on Zoom with him and talk about changes that had to be made. And he could actually look in 3D space at things, as opposed to sort of trying to show either 2D renderings or plans and sections, which are a little bit more abstract. Like, this was a very concrete thing that I could sort of share virtually. And that was true of many other collaborators as well. Stage managers, production managers, everybody at different phases of the process. So this model came about. It was really a long process. We received a set of 2D drawings from the theater. Actually, it was a really comprehensive set of drawings, but as sometimes happens, none of them matched each other. So we had a really detailed drawing of actually the stage house. A survey had been done in 2019. I'm sorry, of the theater house, which showed in very fine detail all of the filigree and every crystal on every chandelier in the house, but did not actually give us a very detailed survey of the stage itself. And then we had another set of drawings that predated that was slightly different. And then we had a series of PDFs. So it was really a battle to try and integrate these drawings into a working 3D model of the space. But we did as much as we could on paper. And then, as you can see, some of the design elements, like these boxes, for example, which had to really carefully integrate with the theater architecture. And by the way, this is a very historic building, so we were warned that we had to be extremely precise with how we implemented these things and careful not to damage anything. And we had to sort of make sure everything fit well and didn't need to be revised on site. So we actually were able to, as part of our production budget, we commissioned a 3D scan of these boxes. So we actually, this portion of the 3D model was given to us as a result of that scan, which gave us a much more precise way of working on those elements. So, and then the second part of, so once we had that model, you know, I started sharing this with the creative team, all of whom are here, or many of whom are here, and we we're talking about best ways to, you know, collaborate lighting, sound, projection, scenic as a team. And I have used project sharing in the past with internally with scenic teams. It's a really great tool for allowing multiple users to edit a file without the risk of overwriting each other's work or creating discrepancies in different people's files. So the way that tool enables collaboration felt really germane for a process like this, where, you know, the number of inches that you know, are the difference between the light being in the right place and not intersecting with the projector beam or various other considerations. So we decided to try project sharing interdepartmentally in this process, and it was we definitely had to do some figuring out. So we created a project sharing file, and we started, you know, everybody input their own work as different layers. And as you can see, and I'll show some different views of this file so people can sort of look around. Let me go to a perspective view here. So as you can see, you know, there are many layers of theater architecture in here, and then all the departments created layers of their own work so that we could toggle on and off each other's elements. And then we just sort of started working collaboratively and you know, figuring out how these elements would fit together. I think there were definitely some initial challenges as far as just, you know, figuring out, like, I think, for example, Drew, you ended up using, rather than directly importing your work, you ended up using a reference file. You know, Fifi and I had some things to work out as far as scaling of elements. But in general, I think we, you know, there was a bit of a learning curve in terms of best practices. But I think, you know, I think I'll throw it over to another team member for now to share their experience, and then, you know, we'll talk more about how this all went. But Fifi, do you want to pick it up from here?
Sure. Hello, everybody. As Grace said, there was a lot of things to coordinate in this project, and lots of things to collaborate on as well, obviously, which I think this process gave us an incredible tool to work with. And I've always wanted to do this project sharing, use the project sharing feature of Vectorworks, but I never had the chance. And having the whole design team involved with it was sure, there were a couple of things that we had to figure out, but it was the smoothest process that I've ever had by far. Do you mind if I take over
Absolutely.
the screen sharing? So here's my model. Same as Grace's, obviously. I'm going to use the clip cube to just kind of give us a nice little section view here of what we have. And you can probably already tell that there's quite a number of lighting instruments in the rig. And we had to be very, very careful, not just about fitting them in amongst the lighting bars or the fly bars of the theater. And we have these fringes that had to follow a very specific line visually, But then we also had these festoons that flew in at certain points in the show, and the fringes also flew. So this is, you can see these two different positions for them. But we also had to allow enough space for the beams of lights themselves. And I think it's probably worth mentioning, Grace, you mentioned the different iterations of the show throughout, or the production throughout its life, having gone from a drama school to St. Anne's Warehouse, then onto Broadway, then on a US tour. The Wyndham's is probably the smallest theatre it's been in, sort of smallest proscenium theatre it's been in. So we were trying to fit in a show that has to be extremely bright. The brightest show I think I've ever seen, with where most of the lighting cues are either, and this is how the story goes. The lighting is either on, off, or green, although it's more nuanced than that. But we had to fit in, and you can see that the level of detail that I gave it while drawing for lighting designer Scott Zelensky, who was in Vermont most of the time. Maybe I think it was probably in the Czech Republic at some points as well. And I was either in Iceland, either in Reykjavik or Ísafjörður, or then in London. So we had to coordinate everything that we did, and I brought the level of detail down to clamps, and that to see just how tightly we could squeeze a double hung rig of tungsten and LED luminaires, and it was also an exercise in how many lights can you actually exactly fit into a theatre. There were lights everywhere. We had to, having the 3D model to help us or understand how do we light around this corner here to hit exactly what we need to hit on stage. And whenever there were any changes, and I opened the model on my end, everything was up to date. Simply incredible, I have to say, how easy it was to work with. Although, to talk about the bad things as well, there was once a point where all the lighting instruments that I have, they're obviously in 3D, and they're all, I'm going to show you what I did. I only use the single layer lighting, but then I have a class for focus points. So you can see that there's a bunch of focus points around here. And at one point, all the lights stopped pointing at the focus points. And I had to go through quite some trouble to get them working again. But apparently this is some sort of a bug in Vectorworks. And all you need to do is to re-import all the lighting instruments from the online library and then refresh your instruments. I wish I'd knew that before I replaced all of them in the drawing. But the other thing that I will show you as well is sort of how we used the now maybe what I'll do. And I have to say, having this 3D model wasn't just helpful, like Grace was saying, when communicating with the director wherever Daniel was in the world, and between Scott and I, it was also really helpful in production meetings where we could explain to stage management or production management, how are things laid out. So if I select these 3 lighting instruments here, and I just turn on their beam, and then view it from the front, you can see exactly what angles we were trying to get. And again, this would normally be spaced out evenly and much further apart in the sort of bigger theaters on the US tour, for example. I think the other thing that 3D has been really helpful in documenting is during the process, and while we joke about the lights are either on, off, or green, there is a lot of the lighting cues are simply on at full blast throughout the whole production or a whole performance. And in the auditorium, we have all these sort of normal 500-watt floodlights, symmetrical. We call them sun floods in the UK. There would be mini tents in the US, and just documenting where they live, even if the model doesn't include the infrastructure for them. That makes it really helpful to come back to the show if it's ever revived. So here is in the background, you can see the section of the surveyed section that Grace was talking about earlier. And maybe one of the things that I'd also like to point out in this process is how I left my sheet layers in the drawing. So let's organize this. So I have a planning section here. So you can see the planning section next to each other. And you can see the stage. Then I have an overheads of the stagehouse, obviously, and then overheads of front of house. And a couple of practicals on stage, and then detailed drawings, plates for detailed drawings or sheets for detailed drawings of each and every lighting position. And one of the things that we had to coordinate carefully was this front of house advanced truss, because it's loaded with lights and speakers. And I think it was at weight limit, or very close to it anyway.
It's at weight limit, and I think within a few centimeters of the architecture on either end.
Exactly. You can see these bars that are actually a part of the theatre itself. We had to be very careful about not crashing into that and not overloading the chain hoists that they were hanging on. And Drew and I had a very fun, collaborative experience when, obviously we had to dimension this completely. And you see, we use the dual dimension, seeing that it's both a UK-US collaboration. But at one point, Andrew, you'll talk more about sort of your process workflow through all of this. But at one point, I get a phone call saying we need these drawings immediately, which was kind of an unexpected rush on the coordinated drawing. But I was out and about, and I was able to message Drew and say, can you open up my sheet? Can you fix whatever needs fixing on your end, and can you dimension it, and then export it and send it on? And I think now the one of the other hats that I carry or wear in theatre is that I work as a theatre consultant on theatre buildings. And what I've experienced in the consulting world is that working standards in architectural practice are extremely rigorous, or definitely more rigorous than we experience in actually creating the performances themselves or the productions. And even though they're not standardized throughout the construction or the architecture industry, each project will have their set of working standards, their layers, their classes, their issuing instructions, their phases, etc., usually dictated by the lead architect. And I'm kind of interested in kind of understanding if there is a way for us to bring some of that into theatre. I'm not saying that we need to be quite so rigorous and quite so meticulous, but I think adopting some of those methods would be very, very helpful. And now I know I'm not gonna go into detail about this, but I know that there are theaters out there that lose money on each and every production, purely down to a lack of coordination between drawings and the venue drawings and the set design, lighting, sound drawings, etc., because they don't line up and they don't coordinate. So at some point something needs to be rebuilt or re-rigged or whatever. And in an industry where every penny matters, I think being able to use or implement more accurate drawings on more accurate venue drawings is something that I think we should strive to as an industry. Drew, do you want to talk about your process a little bit?
This is something I was gonna talk about as well. The practice of not just collaboration but coordination, which we attempted, and we did as much as we could with our limited time and resources. But I think on a bigger show with a more complicated elements and bigger teams, being able to really coordinate classes and layers and sheet numbering and standards, even if it's not up to architectural standards, would be a really useful way so that anybody on anybody's team can open up a drawing, make changes that are relevant and match the style and system of the rest of the drawing without mucking anything up, right? But yeah, I can talk about my side of things. So the sound system for Oklahoma has evolved over the years, but is based on this thing called Soundscape, which is a system from a company called D&B, which really helps localize the actors. We're trying to make it as very natural as possible. So the idea is that you don't really hear the speakers. And part of what's needed in order to do that is really accurate speaker placement. Not so much exactly that they have to be in a specific place, but the system, the processor, needs to know exactly where they are. So part of my process is actually working in their software in the planning phase and figuring out where the speakers are going to go. Can I get the right coverage? How big the speaker I need? All these things, predict how loud I can make it, because even though it's a very quiet, naturalistic show, there are moments that are very loud. So I do all that sort of predictive work in this acoustic software. And in order to not duplicate my efforts, I can export DXFs from that, which are just 3D DXF drawings of the speakers themselves. And in the past, working on my own, I've just kind of referenced those into my Vectorworks file, tried to figure out if that was actually going to work, because the sound software doesn't really have a very accurate modeling system. So in terms of the architecture, so then I take notes and I go back to there and I move some speakers around and then I re-export and then just refresh. That's all sort of linked to these DXFs. Refresh the Vectorworks, the speakers jiggle about till they fit. What was really nice about this process is that Grace drew everything in 3D, which is a luxury in and of itself. But because the tolerances are so tight with the speaker placements and the lighting and the rigging and the scenery and the architecture, and we were dealing with some very strict guidelines when it came to sight lines as well, being that it's a 3-level theater. And we have, you saw the fringes and festoons and all this stuff that has to hang in the house. So how do we get the speakers to point at the people, get the fringes to hide some of the architecture and the lights, get the lights to point where they're going to go, and all of this has to stay out of the projector beams. So it was really, really great to be able to sort of eliminate a lot of the iterative steps where I did my predictive analysis for the speaker locations, got those into Vectorworks, then I could very quickly see what interfered with what and exactly how they had to move. So I could update that in the acoustic model, and it was a lot faster and a lot more accurate that way. We did run into a few issues with, I think, maybe Grace, you mentioned that in order to alleviate a headache for everybody else that was collaborating on the project sharing side, I imported the DXFs, referenced them into another Vectorworks file, and referenced that Vectorworks file into our shared file, which made the refreshing and updating a lot easier. And it also fixed, there were some weird scaling issues that every third time somebody opened up the drawing, the speakers were much smaller or much larger by factors of 10 for some reason, when we were just directly referencing the DXFs. Yeah, I think that aspect of really cutting down on the number of steps to get to a place where we felt good and everything was coordinated. And of course, once we got to the theater, all of that had to change because the realities of drawings never quite match the real thing. And then we could also much more carefully inspect the sight lines and all of that. Was super useful.
Yeah, I was going to say, oh, sorry, just to jump in, like, I think the ability to even start those conversations ahead of time about like, okay, how far is the speaker hanging into this, even as far as like speaking with the director about like, what are his priorities in terms of like, we need this much speaker to be visible to get the shot. So what does that mean in terms of what you're seeing? Like, even if we had to change things later, it was really valuable to talk about that ahead of time.
Even that level of detail was really helpful in dealing with the venue and the venue owner, who is very protective of their venue. It's historic. There's put a lot of work into preserving and restoring a lot of the detail, and it's beautiful. And they rightly want to show that off, and don't want to put a whole bunch of lights and speakers in the way. So it was really useful, especially on a sort of global collaborative effort, to be able to tightly coordinate that and then get some accurate renderings of like, okay, if you're sitting in this seat in the balcony, here's a fairly accurate rendition of what you're probably going to see. It's not as bad as when you look at it just a plan in a section and that looks like it's hanging really low, and it's really obvious because it's in a big bold black box sitting there. So I think that was really helpful on the political side of things, even just being able to prove that it was going to work, so we didn't have to totally rethink everything when we got to the venue. Yeah, I think
there was
Josh,
sorry, Drew, there was one issue where I struggled with getting the speakers to show up in my model, and I think it's just worth mentioning because I tried everything, tried refreshing the reference that you had, and tried all these different things, and it turned out the problem wasn't a Vectorworks problem; it was a Dropbox problem. Whereas my Dropbox is set not to sync files that I don't touch for a while, so your Vectorworks file and your DXF file, for some reason they were offline only, and for some reason that meant that the reference into my side of things was broken. But then I just made them always available offline, and that fixed it. And I think I just wanted to kind of mention that.
Yeah, there's the way, I think it took a bit for us to figure this out, but the referenced file needs to reside in the same Dropbox folder as the master project file, and it needs to be synced to your machine locally for each user. Otherwise, because the reference doesn't happen necessarily in the project file, right?
Yeah. And I think in terms of using references versus working direct, like I think I went back and forth about whether it made more sense to reference in the scenery versus actually just import all the objects and edit them in the master file. And I ended up going with the latter because I found it really useful to be looking at the lights and the projectors and the speakers and actually be able to edit things in real time. But on the subject of the sheet layers, then you end up like it's sort of a decision about whether you're creating your entire show package in the master file or whether and I actually ended up having a clone copy of the scenic file that had all my sheet layers, which I think is, speaking of things we would do differently, that was sort of something that was not a great system that I ended up kind of being stuck with because of how things went. But
yeah, I did the same. I started down the path of doing it in the project file, and I think there's one sheet layer for sound on there. But yeah, I think it was super useful to be able to go into the lighting drawing because we had to coordinate this thing, and the drawing had to show the coordination to the riggers who had to prepare
Right.
their stuff. So, you know, if he was traveling and I could update the speaker positions because something ended up asymmetrical for some reason and something I did, and it needed to be very, very symmetrical. So I was able to go in there, fix that, and reissue that drawing that Fifi had created.
Yeah.
But, you know,
Speaking of coordination, Josh,
You wanna-
take over.
you wanna jump in? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the video for the show, again, it's like a lot of the show, it looks very simple, but ends up actually being very complicated. And one thing that complicates video is how many lights there are in the show, and speakers, and everything. And you know, the video happens in the dark. I can show just a picture so that people can visualize the show a little bit. But so the video's in the dark, which is kind of a dream come true for anyone who's making video, that you don't have to compete with the lights. However, it needs to be a surprise. The video pops on after this blackout moment in the show, and it's a complete surprise because there hasn't been any video up to that moment. And so hiding the projectors and keeping them out of sight and keeping them so that you can't hear them and so forth is all very important for everybody, I think. But with so many lights, it's always been a challenge in finding a place to put them. And we found some very small, brand new Panasonic 25K projectors that were quieter than they were about as loud as a 10K in an older version. But they're still big. And so I would look at the 3D drawing and I would see spots where it looked like there were gaps. And then I would ask Fifi and say, can I put the projector here? He'd say, maybe, but maybe not. And so then we would hedge back and forth. And I finally found two positions on the end of the first electric, just behind the proscenium, to put two of the projectors. And there were 4 total on stage, 2 that project on the side walls and 2 that are blended to project on the back wall, as you just saw in the photo I showed. And the producers cut the budget so that the stage shrunk by how much, Grace? How much did they bring the top of the stage down?
I think we lost like 6 feet or more. You know, it was a significant change.
But it was 1.8 meters.
Oh,
It
yeah,
was something like that, yeah.
Oh,
About
yes,
6
yeah,
that is
about
6.
6. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Which I didn't realize, nobody did, but what it meant for lighting was that their lights would have to go lower. The fringe would not clear as highly. Oh, that's something I should mention. When the video comes on, the fringe that's on stage rises up out of the way to clear the beam of the projectors. So it's another element of the surprise, is that you don't see the projectors because actually there's fringe also in the way. And maybe we can see on the view here. I only saw 2 projectors when I saw your drawing earlier, but
Sorry, I was muted there. Yeah, so as you were saying, Josh, this is the fringe, like, and Fifi mentioned earlier. So this fringe flies out to the top of the wall. And here's a speaker position that
the projectors are the blue boxes behind those holes, and then there were 2 more just below them, which I don't see in this drawing for some reason.
Oh yeah, I think this may be a pre-tech drawing. So
anyway, so when the set was lowered for budget reasons, it meant that I could no longer put my projectors at the ends of the first electric because they would have been in the way of light. And the difficulty, I guess, with the drawing that I had was that a lot of the stuff behind the stage, backstage, by the proscenium, etc., wasn't actually drawn by the theater correctly, so that in our model it wasn't correct, and so then it was very difficult to determine a position. But I did finally find some. But the drawing, I would say, made it 100% more easy to find places to put these things in a slightly less than theoretical way. Like often where I put the projector, it's kind of like, well, I mean, I think it'll go fine there, and then I'll do a basic calculation of throw and say, okay, I'm wide enough, I can hit it, it'll be bright enough. And often, yeah, it's just kind of it's not exactly guesswork, but it's not exactly a hard fixed position. It's pretty flexible. But so I'd say working with this with the group was very helpful. I could see where the lights were and so forth. One thing that I also enjoyed about working with a 3D drawing, which I did the same thing at the Young Vic, so this wasn't new to me here, but I'm going to share my heat map. So I was able to extract the set by turning off layers and taking what I wanted from the vector drawing and put it into mapping matter. And then I could see exactly where my beams were and how bright they would be. What works very nice, Vectorworks works well with this, where I can take it out and it shows up accurately. In the past, something like that, I would have had to build a sort of 2-scale model in Cinema 4D or something and put it in, and then taking that and putting that into mapping matter. So this was nice because I could extract it right from the drawing in Vector. Yeah, so that was basically my experience with it. It helped me with positioning and also visualizing. One thing that if I could, can I say something I want to be improved?
Yeah.
Go for it.
I don't know exactly how or what is the problem, but I can't take the model out and build accurate UV maps for Disguise. So Disguise is the software that we use to project the video onto, and it's needed. You need a model inside Disguise that's the same as what you're projecting onto. And for whatever reason, and this is just a question to somebody out there, when you take the UV map from the model when you build a UV map from the model that's in Vectorworks, it comes out all crazy, and I just have to do it myself. So anyway,
It's interesting
for the future.
If I can tag on to what you're saying there, Josh. Whatever the issues with exporting into Disguise, I'm sure that can be solved. It just needs the right settings and the right format, and on both ends. But what is interesting is that working in 3D, you bring your work into 1 or 2 different pieces of software. Drew, obviously, his file originates in 3D and Soundscape. What was the software called, Drew?
It's ArrayCalc.
ArrayCalc. Yeah. On the lighting side of things, we did, for a laugh, import the model into ETC Augmented. The show is programmed on an EOS, although there isn't really a need for it because A, it's not touring, and B, there were only eventually 7 moving lights used in the show, 6 maybe. So we weren't necessarily using these control functions, but the level of coordination and control outside of the actual 3D model that working in 3D gives us is something that I think the industry as a whole could benefit greatly from doing more of.
Absolutely. It's the way all these predictive pieces of software, then control software, the visualization software, everything is in 3D. And it makes it really difficult if the thing you're starting with is 2D.
I agree. And I think as someone who's spent a lot of time making physical 3D models, and that's a huge kind of time and money investment, and I think often has limited use, especially collaborating with interdepartmentally, because it's cumbersome and it doesn't do a lot of the things that we're talking about. Like, I'm interested in what is the future of, obviously, and there's some utility still, like a physical model is more accessible to a larger number. It can go to rehearsal, it can do all these things, but I think I'm looking for ways to sort of in some ways replace that process with this, and open-endedly, how do we then make it a more inclusive thing that can be accessible to people that aren't as technical, or this is it's not their role to be working in software. But
well, speaking about how we collaborate on this, I cheekily shot a few screenshots throughout the process that I'm probably in breaking some sort of a GDPR law or something by sharing these. This is from a production meeting, and we're obviously all in different countries, different parts of different countries. And here is a screen sharing moment from a production meeting. On the right-hand side, you can see all the different people. And in this particular meeting, we're talking about this this little speaker hole there that was a grill for a sound monitor. And we were talking about the coordination of that and whether it could be brought underneath the gun rack, etc. And just being able to throw that out in front of everybody without, you could never get 20 people around one model. But there, 20 people or 20 or 30 people had that on their screens, and we can actually zoom in and we can look at it in far greater detail than ever before.
And even say, like, trying to do that on PDF drawings would be hard it's hard to visualize exactly what it's going to be, and everyone has to look at their own thing. And oh, if I move this, then go to their drawing and change. Whereas we could just, if we move the gun rack up and I move the speaker down, where's that intersect the framing, and how are we going to work around? Was a lot more accessible.
Here is a drawing on the 2D. I wasn't quite sure. It wasn't entirely clear from which of the different drawings we had the cutouts for the chains from the chain hoists in terms of coordinating exactly where that truss would go. So this is just a sketch from me showing, I think it could be the green ones, it could be the red ones, it could be the blue ones. This is a design team meeting when we're talking about, where do different beams hit in terms of, from lighting, in terms of fringes, in terms of speakers, etc. And here we're talking about the sort of, using the X-ray function, talking about monitor placement and probably front fills as well with the pit and that little thrust that we had, and just carrying on from few different angles, looking at these shots. This is probably from discussing, Josh, that this is where you had the speakers on the first electric LX1 and projectors, and just being able to drop the walls, drop the lighting bars, and visualize the beams. We realized, I think, much more quickly than we would have from doing 2D sketches from a plan in a section, what the issue was with this. And again here, again coordinating, because the concept of it is to be an extremely tightly lit in a small space, acknowledging all the issues that brings to coordinating the show. And here is an example of how I think this is a lighting pipe that I drew based on the 2D drawings, but then we did the 3D scan and they didn't quite line up. So I lined them up to the 3D scan more than I did to the 2D drawing. And yeah, that's sort of my scrapbook.